Hi, and welcome to part 2 of this series where we're going to be looking at collapsing margins, resets, and the box sizing property, so stick around. Hi, and welcome to part 2 of this series where we're doing a deep dive into margins and paddings. In this video, we're going to be looking at collapsing margins and when they don't collapse, CSS resets and resetting our margins and paddings, as well as the box sizing property. Now, one thing that can cause the most confusion is collapsing margins. A lot of people really don't understand what they are, what's going on, how they're working. So we're going to start there. We're going to work from there into when they stop collapsing. Eventually, we'll get into the whole resets to get rid of some of how that's happening or how we can better handle it. And then finally, we're going to be taking a look at the box sizing property, which just makes padding make a lot more sense. Alright, so welcome back to CodePen. We're going to be continuing our look at margins and paddings. So I have two pens here. Again, the links for both of these are down below, so if you want to explore them a little bit. This first one is just to give us a really basic understanding of how collapsing margins are working. Then we're going to go into text, which is a more real-world example of where you'll run into this type of problem, and also where we'll explore fixing it and some other stuff as well. So right here, what we're going to do first, you can see I have my demo box, which has the margin 100 top and bottom, and auto left and right just to center it. And then my boxes inside that just have a color and a height. All my other styling is down below, but for demo purposes, we don't need to get into that. I just wanted to keep all the demo stuff up here. So what do collapsing margins even mean? Well, a collapsing margin, let's go on my box one here and give this a margin bottom of 100 pixels. And that will probably do what you expect. It creates an empty space underneath of 100 pixels. What a collapsing margin is if two things have the same, or have margins that are touching one another, their margins will collapse, or one of the margins will collapse. Pretty much it means they'll merge together. So if I do a margin top of 100 pixels on my box 2, nothing changes. The top margin of this and the bottom margin of this are merging into one another. So it's not creating a 200 pixel space like a lot of people would assume would happen. So it would be a more intuitive behavior, but it's not what happens because CSS. That's just how it is. So to highlight how this is working, or not how it's working, but what's actually going on here, we're going to look at the inspector. So I'm just going to right click and choose inspect element. If you're in Chrome, it would be inspect. I don't know what they have it in Edge or Internet Explorer. In Safari, it's inspect, I believe, as well. The only difference in Safari is you'll have to go into your properties and DevTool settings and stuff to turn it on if you're in there. So this gives me a whole bunch of stuff. Actually, it'll probably be here when you turn it. And it gives me this little arrow thing. And it's the same in Chrome. It's a little different in Safari. It's like a pointer or like a target thing or something. But this lets me go on top of stuff and highlight what it looks like and what's actually going on. And if I click on this one here, it gives me their properties. But if I go to computed or layout, I can actually see the box model. So the box model is my margin, my border, my padding, and the content itself inside. So you can see when I'm doing this, it's highlighting the different parts. So I have the content itself, and that yellow area is the margin on the top. And I go on this one, there's the yellow margin on the bottom. So you can see that the two margins, they both have a margin, but the margins are the same size and they're just merging into one another. So if I take this one and I make it 200 pixels, that one's going to win. So here I have 100 pixels and it just stops because that is merging in to this one here, which is 200. So the bigger one is going to win and that's it. And then my smaller one there is just smaller and does effectively nothing. It's useless. The small one is literally not doing anything at all. So you can see it's a little bit of a weird behavior, but you wouldn't think that would cause too much issue because it's not often you'll run into stuff like this where you're trying to create a bigger space like that, right? Where this becomes a big issue is on my first box here at the top. I'm going to add a margin top to my box 1. And you might have run into this before, so you might be going, I know what's going to happen. But trying, the logical thing would be, it would move it down inside my box, my demo box here. So let's add like 300 pixels to make it big and obvious. And what just happened? My whole box moved down. I hate this so much, personally. But, we live to get around it. And I don't like it because it's not intuitive. I like things when they're intuitive and they work the way you'd expect them to, and no one would expect something like that to happen unless you know about it, obviously. So what's happening here is I mentioned before, if the margin bottom of this and the margin top of this were touching, they'd merge together. So in this case, because my 1 and my demo box both start at the same point, even though this is the child of this one, they're both lined up together at the top. So their margins technically are touching. So if their margins are touching, they merge together. So if I go and I look in my inspector here, sometimes you're hovering around trying to figure out what's causing it. You can't, there's a big empty space. I don't know what it is. That's not just my body. There must be something else. Eventually you figure out it's the thing inside the thing that's actually causing it. Because, whoops, let's just click on here. If I use here, so I have my 1, but if I'm looking at it in here, I'm looking at my demo box. I'm going, there's a huge space on top of my demo box. I don't get what's going on. I see that there's my margin here and here, but yeah, I set that up. What's going on? Why is there that giant gap? Oh, it's coming from this. And sometimes it's not even this one, right? It's like nested like 7 deep because you just have a bunch of divs going on or something. So it can be a bit annoying to try and find. But yeah, that's kind of weird. Now, one solution I've seen, or just to show you what I mean by the margins touching, is if there's anything to create a separation between them. So here, if I give this a border top of say 15 pixels so we can see it, solid black, it gives me a border. So now I have a 100 pixel margin, then a border, and then my 300 pixel margin. So this border is going in between the two margins. It's creating a separation between the two. They're no longer touching each other, so they're no longer collapsing or merging together. So one solution I've seen from time to time is padding top 1 pixel. So what's happening here is, we can't even see it, it's so small. So let's just make that like 10 pixels so we can see it on our screen. See that purple line now on the screen at the top here? Just over here, we'll see that purple line. That's the padding. So the padding is creating a space between the margin and the content inside of my demo box. So that's creating a separation between the margin of this and the margin of this. So I've seen people set that to 1 just to create a little like invisible line and then use their margin on this like they would expect to. But why do that when you could just say that this padding top is 300 and then you don't have to worry about a margin on that at all? You're already setting a padding top on this anyway. So just do it all in that. So again, padding is creating space inside of something. Margin is creating space outside of something. But padding is a lot more, behaves in a way you'd expect it to behave a little bit more. So padding doesn't merge because it doesn't. Margins can merge together or collapse together is the technical way of saying it. So you might be saying, I'm never going to run into a situation like this. These boxes, this isn't a realistic thing. So let's look at something a little bit more realistic. And we're also going to use this to push things a little bit more into our resets and look at some other behaviors that you might not expect as well. So here we just have some basic text. Again, there's some more styling down below that doesn't really matter too much for what we're doing here. So here I have this nicely set up. I'm happy with my text, but there's some stuff I want to do on here. So one thing to know is that by default, all text has margin on it. That's why we have space around everything here, right? So I'm getting all these spaces everywhere. This is all just coming from margin. All of our text has margin. Not for sure because H1s, it's a little smaller, but as a general rule of thumb, the margins on your text is about the size of the text size. It's usually set to 1em. It's like 0.83 or something for H1. So here I have a div class of intro, and then I have an H1 inside of it. So what I see sometimes happen is someone does intro, background, blue. Let's go with light blue maybe, so it looks a little better. Light blue. There we go. So that looks okay, but you know what? I want my text to be a little lower down. I don't really want it to be there, and well, they're already doing some styling. So they already have like their intro H1. They have font size 2, or let's do like, I don't know, 50 pixels, make it bigger, something like that. And then they go, the color is steel blue. So they're styling away at their text. So while they're in their text, they go, I want some more space around it. So let's add some margin top of 50 pixels. Oh, that didn't work. Let's make it bigger. And wait, that can't be right. I'm putting it on my text. I want the space on my box. My text is inside my box. This is the collapsing margins, guys. Even though, and a lot of the time, this is just the way that the text is rendering. You'll get like a spacing around it. So it looks like your text isn't touching it, but it is, because you have your intro and then you have your H1. So what's happening is this is merging with that. Then they go, oh, okay, let's just like add like padding of like 10 pixels here. And like, boom, it's massive, right? Because they have the whole thing here. So we can just take all that off. But now, okay, I have my padding of 10 pixels, but that's not 10 pixels. That's huge. What's going on? Why is it so big now? This is because of the default margin on here. So I'm just going to do a little inspect on here. Inspect is your friend. It's always what's going to solve your problems. So you can see H1 has a margin top and a margin bottom. So you can see that we have a margin top and bottom on there. And after the margin, there's a padding. So what you'll often have to do when you really want to control how something is going to look is then have a margin of 0 on it. So now that there's a margin 0 on it, I can control exactly how big I want this padding to be, whether I want it to be 10, 50, whatever I want. Now the font is rendering a little weird because there's some extra space on the top and bottom, so it's not perfect, but you get a much more fine tuning once you get rid of those margins. Now, just really quickly, if we look at all of our text has a margin top and bottom. And what's happening is, you can see here and this one, they're merging together. They're doing the whole collapsing margin thing. And here, and I have my list there, so we can see that they're collapsing together. And once again, here, they're collapsing together. We have tons and tons with text. It's just constant collapsing margins. Oh, and just one thing really fast, in case ever you're doing something and you're like, some spacing issues get really weird. On my demo box here, if I change this to a display grid, because you want to use some nice CSS grid stuff, let's just undo that. See how everything, it's collapsing margins, so like my spacing's not terrible. And then when I turn off that, see how the spacing just all got a lot bigger? So display grid, collapsing margins no longer collapse. And this is the same also for display grid. Display grid, not grid, flex. Flex box is the same thing. I'll also have to do flex direction column for this though. So let's turn off my display flex. You can see they're closer together, and when I turn that back on, they all get spaced back out. So just to know, sometimes when you change the parent container, it changes the way the collapsing margins work on the children. Weird, it's how CSS works, and it's with display flex, display grid. I think is the only time that actually happens. But don't take my word on that. There might be, those are the times you'll probably run into it the most anyway. So just be aware that that might happen. So a lot of things come with, a lot of different things come with our defaults, so like we were just looking at. So again, if I look here, I have my paragraphs, my H1 all the way to H6, H2, H3. Here I have a pre for like code blocks and stuff. Those have margins on them. This is a list. My list items all have padding and margin on them. Figures have margins on them. Everything, this is a quote, I think. Is that a quote? No, it's just a paragraph. Okay, well, it's just a paragraph. I don't know why it's indented. But you know, everything comes with some sort of default on it almost. It's kind of frustrating. So one thing you might want to do, and you don't have to do this, but a lot of things that people do, especially when they're first starting off, is they just want to turn all the margins and padding off, all of them off, because that way they don't run into issues like this and there's not these weird things happening. So we can do that with the wildcard selector, which is just this. This just means select everything. Selects everything. Any element, it's selected. The only thing this won't be selecting is pseudo elements, but we're not going to get into that. And there are ways of selecting those too. But we can do this. So I'm selecting everything, and I can just say margin 0, padding 0. And when I do that, you can see everything just gets stuck together. Now my lists get a little screwed up because they had their padding. So this does mean you're overwriting everything. So if you do have lists, you do probably want to have to add padding back to them so they're not sticking out the side and looking really ugly. It might cause some issues along the way with some other stuff. So just be aware that you're starting from scratch. But sometimes starting from scratch is easier because you probably wanted to change a lot of those things as well. So now what I could do is I could just say H1, H2, H3, margin bottom is like 0.5 em, and even margin top is, say, 1em. So what that's meaning is the space on the top is bigger now than the space on the bottom. And to me, that makes more sense because now the heading is closer to the content that it should be with, which is an important thing we'll be talking about more in the next video. I could say my paragraphs have only a margin bottom of even like 0.75em maybe. And if you're not sure about ems, it just means that's like if my font size is 10, this would be 7.5. It's in relation to the font size. So if your font size is 20, then it's 75% of it. This would be 50%, exactly the same. So if my font size is 50, my margin top is 50. I do have a whole video on ems and rems if you're curious more about those. But we're not going to get too much into that. But yeah, it just means you're coming through and you're manually bringing it all back in afterwards. So you do have to take into account that this can cause some issues, like with my lists here, that you'll have to be doing everything from scratch, and maybe you don't want to do that. If you're used to the defaults, sometimes that's okay, and you get used to it and you just work around them. But sometimes the defaults really do cause some issues, and it can be easier just to reset everything and then move on from there. Also, just here I'm adding margin top on my headings, but pretty much for everything, I try and use margin bottom only. Just by sticking with margin bottom on everything, you know where your spacing is coming from. You use your padding all over the place because padding is a little bit different because you're pushing things inside, you're adding background color to stuff. But when it comes to margins, just as much as possible, and there's always going to be exceptions. But if you can just go, I'm always going to use margin bottom, you always know where the space is coming from. You just look at it. I look at this, I see a space, I know where that space is coming from. I know, you just know, because it's always coming from the thing above, because that's everything is margin bottom. So that could be one. If you are using a reset, try and stick to margin bottom all the time, and it will probably make your life a lot easier in your own coding. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get into the last thing of this video, which is box sizing, and this is what can also make your life a lot easier. So to look at this, I'm actually going to go back to this video right here, and let's go down to number 3, because we never got to play with number 3, and he's lonely. So I'm going to give him a width of 100 pixels. All right, and let's actually put some content in here. Let's make his height a bit bigger too. Let's make him an actual box, and let's just write hello world in there so we have some content. Does that fit? It's a little tight. Color white. And you know what? Let's take these two out because we don't need them. Okay, so we have hello world. Perfecto. Whoops. And you know, we'll make this a little bit bigger. Just there we go. Okay, we're good. So here I have my box. It's 200 pixels by 200 pixels, and I have this text inside of it. Now, I don't want my text to be touching the side or touching the top. I want to create some empty space around that. So, you know, let's use some padding. So I'm going to do padding top of 50 pixels and a padding left of 50 pixels. But, oh man, my whole box just got bigger. Because remember, the total size of something is the margin plus the padding plus the border. All three of those come together to make the total size. So now my box is actually 250 pixels tall because I added 50 pixels, and it's also 250 pixels wide here. Oh, that's kind of annoying, right? And just to show you, let's turn number 2 back on just for a second. And we'll actually just do height 200 pixels, width 200 pixels. That would just be like our baseline. So this was the original size, and now we can see that it's gotten wider. And that's annoying because then I have to go, oh, my width is actually now has to be 150, and this should be 150. Okay, let's go take a look again. Okay, now it's, you know what though? I think it's a little big. Let's actually make this 30 and 30. Whoops, where'd we go? 30 and 30. Oh man, now I have to change this to 170 and 170. You get the picture. It's annoying. You have to keep sort of playing with them. You don't want to do that, do you? No, you don't. So what we can do for this is we can use box sizing. So box sizing, the default is content box, which means that the size of the box is on this one here, the content. Let's hover on this. Boom. There we go. So the size of the box when I'm giving it a width and a height is calculated based on the content box. It's looking at only the content box. We can change box sizing to border box. there's no padding box. They tried, I think they wrote a spec for it, but nobody supports it. So there's no padding box. There's content box and border box. There's also no margin box. Content box or border box. And, oh, look, that's smaller now. So what's actually happening now is, whoops, 2000 is a little big. It's calculating the padding as part of the total size. So it's going, okay, I need to be a total height of 200 pixels. So my padding is 30. So my content will be 170. And the same here for the width. Well, I need to be 200 and I have 30. So I'm going to adjust my content box inside to be 170. So my total is 200. And if we come and we add a border on here, border 25 pixels, solid red, you can see it's adding that border inside of my box instead of adding to the total size. Because if we take this off, it's by default, everything would add to the total size. So the border box just makes my life so much easier, because now instead of always having everything get bigger and bigger and bigger and having to really figure out your widths and heights, and well, heights you probably won't use too much, but it can get annoying. So this just makes sure that padding's always adding to the inside of your box. It's really just pushing things in. It's not creating extra empty space it's not creating extra empty space. It's just pushing things inside your box, which I think is a more intuitive way of working. And in a lot of projects, since you're already setting up something like a reset, or if you are setting up a reset, and even if you're not, you can still use this and come on here and say that your box sizing is border box. And I do that like all the time. I don't usually actually use my reset. I don't know why. But I will use this pretty universally. I find this is like a lifesaver. It just makes things much more intuitive and easy to work. So it makes padding make a little bit more sense, and it makes it work the way you'd sort of expect it to. So, along with your resets that you did, you can just add it in there. So I hope you learned something about what we just covered. And if you did, of course, leave a comment down below to let me know. Or if you have any questions, don't be shy. Go down to the comments as well. Also, if you ran into a strange behavior or something you're not understanding with margins or paddings that I haven't talked about, please also let me know down in the comments. If you like this video and you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, I encourage you to subscribe because you get more content like this every single week. Next video we're going to be looking at is a real-world example of using the white space that we can create with margins and padding to make a really nice-looking layout. Before we get to that, though, I just want to give a big shout-out to all my patrons who help make this possible. If you'd like to support me or just learn more about what Patreon is, there is a description down below. And until next time, don't forget to make your corner of the internet just a little bit more awesome.